Great. Christopher Leise came to Whitman College in 2009. He earned his BA at Hofstra University and a PhD in English and American Literature at SUNY Buffalo in 2007. He had a little bit of teaching before, but now has been teaching in our English department and our environmental humanities program and offers courses contributing to the Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies program. Chris, I'm going to say your bio on the webpage is pretty hilarious.
Thank you.
But good things to know about Chris is that he has two teenagers and a third child who's getting there, in his opinion, too quickly. And at some point when we are finished with the lecture, if you want to ask Chris why he believes American Puritanism never existed, that could be a great conversation starter afterwards. His modern and contemporary American literature courses focus on the built environment and on American Christianity, respectively. He also teaches introductory literary studies, American Indian literatures, African American literature, a first-year seminar on the Candyman horror franchise, and various special topics courses. He has been an invaluable addition to the English department and the Whitman faculty, and has been very quick to respond when called upon by this office. And for that, we are grateful. Chris, I happily turn the program over to you.
Okay, well, good evening, and thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to join us. As with any event of this nature, it's appropriate to begin with even more thanks. In particular, I'd like to express my profound gratitude to donors to the Whitman College Parents Fund, whose generosity has made my research collaboration with many students, and in particular, in this case, Aaliyah Fard, possible in the summer of 2021. Thank you also to Associate Dean of Faculty Development, Mary Roshko, and Dean of Students, Kazi Joshua, for working with Aaliyah and with me to make some crucial adjustments to the time frame of our research program that made us ultimately successful. I also want to do, and in this case, the best really does come last, to offer genuine thanks to Jennifer. Jennifer Northam works really, really hard to keep the Whitman community in vibrant contact across so many years and across so many miles. Jennifer is a friend to us all, so thank you to her as well. Before explaining a little bit more about myself, that's it all interesting, I want to call your attention to the first sentence of W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial The Souls of Black Folk. Published in 1903, Du Bois released this hybrid work of history, biography, slice of life sketches, and fiction after revising a fair number of the magazine articles that made him famous. He added some original writing and structured the collection by pairing extracts of more established poetry with lyrics from what he called the sorrow songs, or proto-blues numbers that were sung by enslaved and formerly enslaved people. So here it goes. Herein lie buried many things, which if read with patience may show the strange meaning of being Black here in the dawning of the 20th century. Take a careful look at what happens to the big parts of the sentence when we introduce commas. The first version most closely resembles what I would advocate for were I an editor trying to make this sentence read with the best possible clarity. And so it would read something like, herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here in the dawning of the 20th century. Another minimalist approach could have another effect, where it might just simply say, herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here in the dawning of the 20th century. One might imagine any number of other configurations, all of which could conform to what editors consider proper style. Du Bois's sentence, absent any commas, may not conform to such conventions. In fact, it may look a bit like a run-on. At the same time, plugging in the commas has the effect of creating subordinate clauses, defining a main clause that looks pretty much like this. Herein lie buried many things which show the strange meaning of being Black. By putting off altogether commas, Du Bois chooses to drive all of the clauses to the level of significance, and he subordinates none. Put another way, the expectation that he be read with patience is not one of the many things that is buried in the pages of the book. He leads with it. And what he leads with is a command that, when you pay attention to the many sources that inform him, leads to a great many possible readings. I was drawn in particular to elements that spoke pretty strongly to me, given the range of topics that the Souls of Black Folk covers. Please know that I don't plan to make claims about all of what it says or what it does. Rather, I'm hoping to call attention to these aspects of the text that only seemed obvious to me after like 20 years of studying colonial New England. So, as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Chris Leise, and I've been teaching at Whitman for 15 years. Although I was technically hired as the college specialist in modern and contemporary American fiction, I have this habit of wondering, well, gee, where did that come from? And when it comes to American literary history, I do agree that it's turtles all the way down. You can always find another layer of origin. But I did feel drawn to try and understand what made American literature in English different from British literature in English, or Canadian literature in English, or Indian literature in English, as opposed to American Indian literatures that also manifest in English. Whenever I did that, tried to find out what made American literature American, I kept running across attempts to unite American literature with its so-called Puritan origins. This interested me for two main reasons. Now, the first reason I was drawn to was the fact that New England wasn't the first place that the English colonized in what we now call the United States. Odd, I thought, that Jamestown didn't get a higher billing in the program of our national history. Second, I always liked the aesthetics of Puritan New England. Superficial? Absolutely. But Halloween is my favorite holiday, and the Salem witch trials struck me at an early age as a fascinating historical mystery. And while their clothes didn't look very cool to me, I did think the setup of a New English town was super cute, and I really liked the architecture. So all these tiny little houses had an appeal to me. I think the setup of New England villages had this appeal, and so it's lucky for me that I wound up in Walla Walla, which to me looks a good deal like New England, except the streets are a lot wider, so that's a bit of a change. For a long time, though, I've been curious about why the so-called Puritans made for a more appealing origin story than Jamestown. Because when you look at how people remember New England's early years, no one clear picture shines through. Sure, Charlie Brown, the Brady family, and of all things, Miracle Whip advertisers have given us images of New English Calvinists to hold up for veneration. And at this point, for those of you who know me, I cannot help myself. So please indulge me 2 minutes of viewing. And I promise I'll get back to Du Bois soon enough.
Your kind is not welcome here. Nor your odd predilections. Miracle Whip is tangy and sweet, not odd. And it's great on mutton. It carries a pox. A pox of tongue. Wagner! It brings madness. It does none of those things. Let's see. If you'd try it, you'd know.
She speaketh the truth. I had some.
Here's the second one. Oh, oh no. Oh, I'm gonna find the second one real fast because it's worth sharing. Okay. I was quite sure I had saved the file in the same spot. This ought to be the one here.
Here come for the foul unholy feast. The one with the red markings. It sits on the table where you sup.
The Miracle Whip?
Aye, the miracle whip. Stand aside that we may burn it.
How was it found? Have you ever tried it? My cousin's friend did. Singed his tongue clean off. Really? Well, maybe a bit. Perhaps you should try it before making such wicked accusations. It's actually quite sweet. And tangy.
I like sweet things. Shut up, Henry.
My cursor again, and then we'll call this back up. Okay. Appreciate your patience there. Okay. What do we see here? Oddly, I see a story unfolding, one that says gobs about American literary history. The first ad clearly recalls Nathaniel Hawthorne's best-known work, The Scarlet Letter. I personally love the casting of Dimmesdale, for he, like me, really seems to enjoy mayonnaise, or a weird copy of mayonnaise, whatever Miracle Whip actually is. He, like me, is also on the well-fed side. In contrast, Dimmesdale in the novel grows wan and pale and increasingly thinner before dying in the novel's end. Sorry for the spoiler. Maybe, the ad suggests, if he just copped to his love of Hester early on, the Boston community could have been spared the turmoil of Hester's tumults. Oh, but alas. In any case, the Hester character gives us two, oh, I must say it, flavors of the New English image. She presents as prim, proper, and upright, the very picture of the priggish Puritan. At the same time, she breaks from her community by standing up for her tastes. This ad captures a tension at the heart of the Puritan myth. Somehow, they're rebellious conformists. They come off as both conservative and progressive at once. The second ad makes plain another element of the Puritan legacy. In it, a clean break emerges between backward Puritans, believers in superstition and persecutors of women witches, and now Americans. I'm told the actress who plays the tween girl with the saucy attitude is really famous now. Ask your kids or grandkids about Sabrina Carpenter. I only know her as the girl in this commercial. And to me, she's a new generation, the American moving out of her British parents' house, growing into a patriot who would rebel and form a nation. The accent helps with that a lot. In both cases, we see an important truth about America's so-called Puritans. The first version we saw was Hawthorne's Puritans. The second feels a good bit more like Arthur Miller's Puritans. In neither case do we see a depiction of the colonial New Englanders, or an attempt to see them in and of themselves. But just as the Scarlet MW traces back to Hawthorne, it doesn't originate from the 17th century. That icon recalls Hawthorne's Scarlet a mid-19th century American artifact. An upright witch, or even an upright accused witch, that's mid-20th century at best. Other myths, like Puritans as inventors of American democracy or Puritans as advocates for religious freedom, those too come from later periods in time. Of course, people always seek to make meaning from history, and I don't suppose people interpret the past usually with the intention of misrepresenting the facts. What's important, though, is the facts that we choose to highlight and how we highlight them, which does affect how we understand the facts' meanings. Short of diving deeply into the primary sources, it's pretty much impossible at this point to understand early American Calvinists, that is, New English colonists, on their own terms. Reading how to interpret these facts often reveals, reading how people interpret these facts often reveals as much about the people who retell the stories as it says about the people who made the facts under investigation famous to begin with. So again, we're learning more about the interpretations or the people who interpret via the interpretations than about the things they study. So maybe Miracle Whip's advertisers aren't historians. Furthermore, their overt motives are plain. They want you to buy their tangy whipped topping. Whatever truths the stories underlying the figure of the American Puritan contain, the Miracle Whip ads also demonstrate very clearly how much value and what competing or maybe even contradictory values we continue to invest in American Puritanism. Working through the details of New English beliefs would take far more time than we have tonight, unless, that is, you fall asleep, in which case I can keep you asleep with minutia from now clear through the morning, maybe even longer. But for the purposes of this presentation, it helps to know that the people we call Puritans comprised a splinter sect within a major divide in Christianity. The Protestant Reformation created a new kind of Christian identity in Europe. They claimed the mantle of Christian, but Protestants could not agree on a platform that bound them together. Beyond opposing Catholicism and the Pope, Protestantism ranged in the early days from objections to minor elements of practice such as like the cloth or the clothing that priests wore, down to, and then there was every manner of disagreement, and so there's just far too much to say. We do believe, though, that New English Christians by the 1630s shared a common interest in John Calvin's teachings. Calvin only admitted two acts as sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and so this is really relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight. In their view, the events of this world could serve as signs of where a corporate body was headed in terms of their salvation. And practices that deliberately flouted defined prescriptions were surely indications that a gathered church stood in violation of their God's covenant. Colonial New Englanders saw themselves as fulfilling a divine covenant forged in the Hebrew Bible. After Israel, Rome, and the Old England all failed to uphold their ends of a godly bargain. I lost my page. So colonial New Englanders saw themselves as fulfilling a divine covenant forged in the Hebrew Bible. After Israel, Rome, and Old England all failed to uphold their ends of a godly bargain, as Cotton Mather has famously described in Magnalia Christi Americana, New England was left to uphold the Judeo-Christian God's covenant with mankind and restore the heavenly kingdom on earth. Mather was only one significant figure who popularized typological and providential frameworks for interpreting New England history. Of course, his work amplifies a trend in the two generations of English immigrants who came to the New World preceding Cotton Mather. That said, the downbeat conclusion to William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation and the evident hand-wringing about how to conduct life that shows up in Michael Wigglesworth's diary suggests that the New English colonists enjoyed far less self-assurance about their saved status than popular perception typically admits. Wigglesworth's apocalyptic poem was the equivalent of a bestseller in its time, and The Day of Doom was read by many. In addition to the eager consumption of Jeremiads and Execution Day sermons, all of this indicates a rather widespread anxiety about Christian God's disposition toward 17th century and 18th century New England Congregationalists. Whether or not they were sure about their standing in God's eyes, however, because they did believe that all groups were either condemned to hell or saved as a group. They paid quite a bit of attention to each other, and so the broad strokes terms of ideal ecclesiastical and concomitantly civil conduct were little disputed. The problem was Congregationalists and independents are the folks that start to grow out of English Protestantism and into the more concrete forms of American Christianity we now know. They couldn't really agree on anything in print. Congregationalism seems to have evolved in part from the conviction that whole church communities were, rather than individual persons, were elected to salvation. And in order to get full membership in the church and then be able to celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, people had to meet these ridiculously high evidentiary standards. Those evidentiary standards eventually morphed into what is generally considered a conversion narrative, and that conversion narrative persists in American discourse everywhere from early slave narratives through to Alcoholics Anonymous testimonials, which all take the form of these kinds of this four-stage conversion narrative that more or less got concretized in around 1636. But the collectivist assumptions also pertained to perdition. So if one person were to be condemned, so must be the entire congregation. This sort of explains the so-called Puritans' reputation for constantly scrutinizing their neighbors' behavior, and for rationalizing their often prurient and sometimes even scandalous concerns with other people's actions, particularly their sexuality. As David Levering Lewis points out, Du Bois's religious upbringing justifies tracing continuities from colonial Massachusetts Bay into his 19th century childhood. He writes, often when I'm reading quotations, you'll notice I take on the sound of a 1920s newsreel or something, 30s newsreel. Du Bois's religious beliefs at this time were superficially orthodox and anchored in the rigorous Calvinism of New England Congregationalism. The first Congregational Church's articles of faith had remained steadfast in their Hopkinsian rigor, a rigor proceeding virtually straight arrow from the tenets of the great divine Jonathan Edwards and his Yale disciple Samuel Hopkins. The divine authority was to be interpreted literally. Man's nature was sinful. Salvation was possible only through Christ, and the wicked were to roast everlastingly in hell. Lewis is Du Bois's foremost biographer and considered often the final word on a lot of things Du Bois. In combination with Du Bois's youthful religious training, Nathaniel Hawthorne's status as a New England writer par excellence makes him another likely influence on a younger Du Bois. The Souls of Black Folk leads its reader to Hawthorne as a source text when averring in the forethought of the first chapter of the book that it ends with, quote, a tale twice told but seldom written, end quote. A scant few pages later, Du Bois revisits the phrase twice told tale, specifically when he's referring to white people's educations, as though the first reference may have been missed. Thereby, Du Bois layers his own prose atop Hawthorne's 1837 canonical connection, the twice told tales. And so what you're starting to see is how he begins to layer up. Well, he's got this this body of the Bible, and then after that he's got Calvin's text, and after that he's got later on I'll show Shakespeare, but also Hawthorne. Of our spiritual strivings, which comes right after the forethought and is the first fully formed essay in the Souls of Black Folk, bears clear emblems of Hawthorne's influence on the hybrid collection of fiction and nonfiction. Du Bois describes his first conscious experience of separation from the white world, i.e., the phenomenon of race itself, as a veil that he had no desire to tear down, to creep through. Perhaps the slant rhyme of creep with Hawthorne's veil of crepe would be insufficient on its own to sustain claims of an intentional connection. But consistent references to the veil begin to unfold in the Souls of Black Folk in an unmistakably typological narrative. In it, post-war African Americans fulfill the role of the ancient Israelites by fleeing in slavery, right, or in the Hebrew Bible, from the lands of Egypt to the land of Canaan. Many of Hawthorne's most popular works, including The Scarlet Letter and stories such as Main Street and The Celestial Railroad, conspicuously engage with New Englanders' similarly framed historical self-conception. Du Bois surely drew from numerous sources in developing the veil as his main metaphor for the strange meaning of being black that his text works to explicate. But despite repeating the twice-told tale phrase, very few people addressed Hawthorne's likely influence on Du Bois. In Hawthorne's sketch, a small town's minister, suddenly begins wearing a black veil over his face for reasons he refuses to define, even for his closest compatriots. As the neighborhood realizes that the Reverend Hooper harbors no intention to ever again appear in public without donning the face covering, their inchoate and incipient reactions begin to take on a decidedly negative and judgmental terms. Tellingly, Hawthorne's narrator deliberately withholds Reverend Hooper's intentions, both from his peers and from the story's readers. And the story thus prevents everyone from accessing Hooper's intentions. We also can't know Hooper's interpretation of the veil's meaning. As he tells everyone, if I hide my face for sorrow, there is cause enough, he tells his betrothed Elizabeth, leaving his statements about the veil's presence in conditional terms. And if I cover it for secret sin, what mortal might not do the same? Again, might not. That's subjunctive. What's something somebody might possibly do? Though Hooper forthrightly states that the veil obscurely typifies a mystery, his friends and congregants cannot restrain their impulse to invest a specific intention into his wearing the objectively meaningless thing. Were they able to accept Hooper's own claim that the veil bore no significance for him or for them or for anybody else, the story suggests that, kind of like in The Scarlet Letter, the town's life could proceed without complication. But the veil's uncanny effect destroys Hooper's relationship with Elizabeth. It renders him aloof from a cohort of Christians with whom he might have shared a mutually sustaining bond. As we will see later with Du Bois's John Jones, whose external aspect also defamiliarizes himself to his friends and his family, Hooper's transformation permanently alienates him from his home society. Although Hooper's explanation of his choice to wear the veil sounds vague in an everyday sense, it invokes the very technical language of John Calvin's identification of a sacrament in the terms of quote unquote mysterium, or of a kind of divine mystery which, quote, consists of the word and the external sign. Calvin's sense of the word here gets very specific, rejecting what he saw as rote papal performances devoid of instruction, relying upon magic. He clarifies, by the word we ought to understand not one which, muttered without meaning and without faith, by its sound merely, is as by a magical incantation, and has the effect of consecrating the element. But rather, the word is something which, preached, makes us understand what the visible sign means. The thing, therefore, which was frequently done under the tyranny of the Pope, was not free from great profanation of the mystery, for they deemed it sufficient if the priest muttered the formula of consecration, while the people, without understanding, looked stupidly on. And so Calvin's taking to task the Catholic practice of performing the ritual of consecration in Latin. People, as a consequence, didn't come to understand what it is what the priest was saying and what it is what was actually happening. And Calvin's really dodgy about what he thinks is actually happening, but we'll get to a second. But it is the case that he wanted people to read and interpret for themselves. Elsewhere, Calvin attributes the sacrament's mysterious nature partly to humans' compromised ability to fully perceive the divine following Adam's betrayal. So when Adam turns on God in the Garden of Eden and commits the first sin, he loses the ability to decode the signs in the world for their heavenly meaning. As Calvin says, the bread and wine are visible signs which represent to us the body and blood, but that the name and title of body and blood is attributed to them because they are like instruments by which our Lord Jesus Christ distributes them to us. This form and manner of speaking is very appropriate in principle, for though it may be the communion we have with the body of Christ is something incomprehensible, not only to the eye, but to our natural sense, it is nevertheless there visibly shown to us. It is a spiritual mystery, which cannot be seen by the eye, nor comprehended by human understanding. It is therefore symbolized by visible signs, as our infirmity requires, but in such a way that it is not a bare figure, but joined to its reality and substance. So it's not only a figure, it is a figure or a word that is attached to the reality and the substance that it, and as he says, it therefore, with good reason, that bread is called the body, since it does not represent it to us, but also presents it to us. So were we not hampered by the consequences of the original sin, we would be able to see what the mystery is showing us. And in fact, it does happen. It's just difficult for us or impossible for us to actually access anymore. So I want to claim that Hawthorne's Hooper, relying on Calvin's idea of sacraments, would have his congregants accept the mystery of his veil as such, and they would appreciate the veil for its pious value without fully understanding what it means. The human instinct toward closure, while understandable, ultimately overrides Hooper's will, and the desire toward closure amplifies the community's or sort of diminishes the community's concern for his well-being, as his neighbors wind up assigning a very narrow, a very familiar, and a frankly cliched sense to this veil, what is otherwise a meaningless, senseless adornment. In dramatizing the process by which people come to take on these meanings, Hawthorne indicts New England's Calvinist adherents, in contrast to Catholics, right? So he's not being anti-Catholic, far from it. Instead, and he's not indicting them for being a passive reliant on an intermediary, as Catholics are, according to Calvin's criticisms. I was raised Catholic, so I don't buy any of it, but rather for he's really concerned. Hawthorne is really concerned about New England's general propensity to conclude the worst about people in the absence of evidence to the contrary. Remember that Calvinism requires a belief in the total depravity of mankind, and Hawthorne expresses his frustration in Calvinists of New England kind of returning to that. Well, we can at least know that everyone is bad. And Hawthorne seems to be advocating that this tendency suffers, inflicts great harm upon the entire community. Note, though, that Hawthorne insists that the veil that Hooper wears is both a type and a symbol, suggesting a distinction between the two kinds of figures, figure one type, figure two symbol. But he does not explain, neither Hawthorne nor Hooper explains what that difference would be. At the same time, he does suggest that they're kind of the same. So again, this is like super confusing, and I think it's deliberately so. To therefore show that the veil is something that signifies something, but it's not a knowable thing, or it's certainly not knowable to humans. I think that Hooper is basically saying this has meaning for God and God alone. Again, he draws attention to the type and to the symbol. Now, we've seen types before, as we see, in the Deuteronomic formula, you see Christians looking to the what they call the Old Testament and seeing figures of the Israelites fleeing Egypt, and then you get Black Christians later on identifying with themselves in it with that type of biblical action. There are other Christians. Cotton Mather shows up again doing a lot of typological readings where he posits that Christ is the antitype or the fulfillment of a thing, and the type exists, and please don't confuse that with antichrist. Antitype, it is the thing itself. And then you see in what Mather would have called the Old Testament prefigurations of what Jesus looks like. And then Cotton Mather starts reading his own history and his ancestors as modern day types of the kinds of people like you would see Nehemiah, Moses, and so on and so forth. Noah, prefigured in Old Testament, then also manifesting in Puritan New England. That being said, the process by which any of this is supposed to happen is supposed to be a mystery. The meaning of these things is supposed to remain mysterious, and the residents of Hooperstown can't stop themselves from drawing meaning anyway. Du Bois's great Barrington roots and his training at Harvard University would have imbued in him a complex network of cultural connections, including a form of the veil containing significant resonances lost on many, many readers today. There are a large number of significant passages contained in the Bible that people can look to for trying to interpret the veil, especially in a sort of Hawthornian Christian manner. But there's also so Du Bois brings great familiarity from a Congregationalist standpoint of the Bible. He also would have known a great deal about Augustinian thought. And so, beyond significant passages contained in the Bible, foremost among the associations that Du Bois might have looked to in New England's literary history include Hawthorne's celebrated Satis, as well as the core tenets of this Augustinian-informed Christianity that we sometimes call Puritanism. Both Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and Hawthorne's tale create these parallel assumptions drawn about a person's inner state of mind. And then they draw assumptions about the disposition of that person's soul toward the afterlife, namely damnation or salvation. And they do this from faulty inferences drawn on a dark exterior coating. According to R.A. Marcus, Augustine understands signs to work as a tripartite entity or three-part entity. Not only must there be a sign that points to a signified, part one is the sign, part two is the signified, but there also has to be someone who observes the interaction of these two things for the sign to mean something. Du Bois and Hawthorne thereby leave the role of their interpreting what they present as outer darkness entirely up to observers. In Du Bois's case, it's going to be the town of Altamaha, and we'll get into that in a second. In Hawthorne's, it's Hooper's congregants. And they ultimately tried to draw associations between the color black and Calvinism's insistence on mankind's innate depravity. This is not a natural association, but one that's built through culture over time. What Hooper's neighbors already believe about humankind generally, Hawthorne implies that Du Bois amplifies, or implies and Du Bois amplifies, um, this 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 tendency to observe the worst about people overdetermines the meaning of a specific sign, which, in the absence of any more information, you've got a dark veil. It doesn't say anything. It should, according to Hooper, communicate humility before God if it says anything at all. But despite New England Protestants' expressed commitment to remaining humble in the face of the divine will's inherent obscurity, Hooper's community immediately begin inferring that there is something amiss with his intellects, that he's stupid, and additionally that the man is guilty of some crime or sin above innate depravity. Over the course of his life, the characters move from merely suspecting that he committed some damnable wrong to believing that they know in truth that the veil caused him to fear his own self. Um, I want to emphasize here that the narrator refuses to describe the world as it is. In Hawthorne's tale, um, in fact, he relates precisely how other people interpret ambiguous signs, right? And the community's faulty conclusions arrive via faulty inference. Hawthorne meticulously depicts, but a reader might be forgiven for missing the unsound reasoning because his narrator describes it so quickly and so calmly and so matter-of-factly that it makes the process of interpretation seem like merely a process of observation. As with Hooper's veil of crepe, black skin factually points to nothing essential to the person within it, but it also carries long encoded beliefs about Black people's immorality and intellectual inferiority, none of which are true, but associated with repeated cultural insistences. Rather than signs pointing to meanings, Hooper's neighbors, like the racists whom Du Bois confronted his entire life, started with a signified, the idea of sinfulness, in search of signifiers. By linking his childhood recognition of the veil with Hawthorne's cognitive errors, Du Bois riffs on most Reformed Christians' certainty about the depravity of mankind. In effect, Du Bois matches Calvinist habits of searching for mankind's actions for evidence of its fallen nature with white supremacists' assurance of some connection between Black African ancestry and inferiority. Put differently, in the same way that ill-conceived notions about Hooper's guilt took hold as truths, racists react to Black people's skin by associating it with derogatory and demeaning stereotypes. But note how Hooper's neighbors take to calling him Father Hooper, implying that he's got Catholic inclinations, though they themselves are the guilty parties in profaning the mystery that Hooper himself remains quite content to leave unexplained. Hawthorne may himself not have been minded, Hawthorne himself may not have minded being accused of thinking like a Catholic, but most New Englanders in his day would have found the comparison insulting. Oops, sorry. So in the coming of John, a short story comprising the penultimate section of Souls of Black Folk, we also get information about the transformation of a small town central personality. John Jones, an ebullient young man who has a somewhat frivolous personality, goes off to a liberal arts institution, and while he's there, he undergoes significant transformations in his outward presentation. After his long-awaited return, his friends and family barely recognize or understand him. Through regionally and religiously coded language, Du Bois pushes the implications of his observation about Calvinist belief to the whole of the U.S. nation's claims to being a saved nation in the eyes of God and being on track to being blessed by God. Perhaps more than any references to Hawthorne, Du Bois would have expected his readers to hear specific typologically framed connotations of Reformed thinking about sacraments in his diction, describing the right and actual ability of Black men to vote. So describing the right of Black men to vote and the actual ability of Black men to vote. So he says in very more straightforward terms, that black men were admitted through the 15th Amendment to the sacrament of voting. I'll show you how this plays out. Seen in combination, Du Bois's appropriation of Hawthorne's infamous tale and Congregationalist rhetoric displays the way in which the veil of race signifies nothing transcendent, but rather it exposes how faulty human logic gives indefinite and even the idea of black skin, which neither is black, it's an organ, right? It doesn't mean anything, but eventually comes to take on this meaning. Voting, on the other hand, fulfills Calvin's terms as both a representation and a presentation of black men's being in the incorporated congregation of the United States. In Of Our Spiritual Strivings, Du Bois explains, the ideal of liberty demanded for its attainment, demanded for its attainment powerful means, and these the 15th Amendment gave him. The ballot, which he before had regarded as a visible sign of freedom, he now regarded as the chief means of gaining and perfecting the liberty which the war had only impartially endowed him. And why not? Had not votes enfranchised the freedmen? Was anything impossible to a power that had done all this? 1 million black men started with renewed emphasis to vote themselves into the kingdom. Du Bois critically categorizes voting as a quote-unquote visible sign, a particular turn of phrase that Reformed Christians are apt to hear as a crucial component because it comes from the definition of sacrament as introduced in the Bay Psalm primer. And it comes from Augustine's often cited definition that a sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Just as with Calvin's Mysterium, and particularly as pertains to the Lord's Supper, Du Bois avers that voting signified the nation's seal of African Americans in the grace of liberty. To fulfill the terms of the godly covenant entailed by that sacrament, the Lord's Supper, joined by all American men to black men with the vote, Du Bois implies black people needed to vote and to continue working out their conversion to the sanctified American project through a liberal education. Put another way, the vote not only served as an indication of black people's disposition toward freedom as Americans, it not only served as a sign that they were freed, but it also became a practice whereby the communities could continue producing their ongoing continual transportation from salvation to salvation from slavery, whether that's literal or figurative, we could get into later. I contend that it's both. Such an understanding of lived faith comports very well with many Reformed Christian beliefs. Du Bois's Of Our Spiritual Strivings makes continued biblical references while depicting African Americans' rights and responsibilities at the ballot box. During Reconstruction, he describes 1 million black men started with renewed zeal to vote themselves into the kingdom. Here, the kingdom equates heavenly salvation with representation in the secular government. But in 1876, Republicans mortgaged that estate for the price of a Hayes presidency, effectively consigning black Southerners back into serfdom. And here's Du Bois again. Slowly but steadily, in the following years, a new vision began to gradually replace the dream of political power. A powerful movement, the rise of another ideal to guide the unguided, another pillar of fire by night after a clouded day. It was the ideal of book learning. Here at last seemed to have been discovered the mountain path to Canaan, longer than the highway of emancipation and law, steep and rugged, but straight, leading to heights enough to overlook life. Those who climbed the path to emancipation, to youth with dawning self-consciousness, self-realization, self-respect, and those somber forests of his strivings, of his own soul rose before him, and he saw himself darkly as through a veil. Some of you might hear the Bible in there. And yet he saw another in himself, faint revelation, power as of his mission. I think that's Paul. He began to have a dim feeling that to attain his place in the world, he must be himself and not another. Carefully reading of the coming of John shows what Du Bois means by overlooking life. Recall that sacrament extended to black men was quickly denied them within a few short years. Subtly but consistently, Du Bois writes that the Black American political experience was a kind of spiritual pilgrimage. White America might either assist in that project and thereby align themselves with the force and will of the Christian God, or they could impede Black Americans, thus imperiling the soul of the nation come Judgment Day. Congregationalists confronting such a picture would have shuddered with concern about the disposition of the national soul. After all, preventing such communion would imply that American white people manufacture deliberately sinful conditions, the wages of which would be taxed on everyone, irrespective of race. So if you believe that God covenants with an entire group, and that entire group now is the United States, and they fail to live up to their obligation by letting Black men vote for the people that will represent them, they let down God's spiritual covenant and consequently are almost certain to be damned. At this point in time, many New Englanders' zeal for abolition, and it's 1903. So while it's the case that slavery has been formally abolished in all cases except, and this is still the case, sadly, prison labor, it is very often the case that Virginia's black laws and other such mechanisms were deployed in order to impose forms of slavery on Black people after the Civil War. This was a very real concern for Du Bois, who saw sharecropping enact forms of kind of economic slavery, who saw the weaponization of vagrancy laws. If a Black man didn't have money, he could be arrested, put in prison, and then forced to labor for such entities as U.S. Steel. Where else does he do this? He does this. Du Bois also does this with Shakespeare. So I'm just going to skip down a little bit. He does this in some measure by remedying the intellectual poverty, or at least he posits that if we can remedy the intellectual poverty that's blighting especially Southern Black America at the time, and he's advocating for a liberal arts training you may be familiar with only the talented 10%, right? He's not saying, and this is one of those things where it's kind of interesting to put him in dialogue with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington gets much maligned for advocating that Black people pursue vocational training, and I find that to be troubling as many other people, but I think that he's looking at the best possible outcome for the greatest number of people, and so Washington is trying to, he creates that famous figure of Black people and white people living as separate as the fingers on a hand. That suggests that they're both conjoined, but that they live apart. I think Booker T. Washington gets criticized quite a bit. I think it's interesting to look at Du Bois, who I think makes a kind of similar regional tone, but he's able to go after a group of people who committed to seeing Black Americans liberated. And so many people, especially in the early days, would go down and set up churches and assist with the Freedmen's Bureau. There was a long New England tradition of advocating for Black rights that's starting to cool at around 1903, and I think he's trying to turn that up. One can fairly guess that if an American reader were to recognize a tale twice told as a commonplace turn of phrase today with significant literary antecedents, they would most associate it with Hawthorne. Fewer now than at Du Bois's time would also recognize William Shakespeare's likely coining of the phrase, owing to the play The Life and Death of King John having largely fallen out of favor in academic and theatrical circles. At the time Du Bois wrote Souls, The Life and Death of King John enjoyed a lot of popularity in the United States. Selections from it featured as one of only 2 Shakespeare plays in a widely distributed anthology aimed at moral instruction. Surprisingly, John's death was one of the first Shakespearean scenes ever recorded on film. It spoke very deeply to audiences at that time, and for that reason, a greater number of Du Bois's readers would likely have picked up on the doubled reference in his time to twice told tales than we would have in ours. The play's torsions between democracy and demagoguery would surely have felt particularly pointed to some readers as Jim Crow sped like a cancer across the American landscape after Reconstruction. Additionally, King John raises questions of national sovereignty, the politics of just war, and what place democracy should have in parliamentary monarchy. Just as King John affords a range of interpretive flexibility on themes regarding the appropriateness and the legitimacy of democratic rule, Hawthorne's iconic face covering and the minister's black veil evades being pinned down to a specific kind of trope or figure. And that allows Du Bois to use it at once as an invocation of the study of sacraments, a meditation on who gets to decode a representative leader's communication, and as a justification for the Black intellectual elite acquiring a liberal arts education. In combination, Shakespeare and Hawthorne provide Du Bois with this contrapuntal literary politics. Both remark on the unpredictable outcomes of democratic processes. The first one dramatizes, or Shakespeare dramatizes, a community's disavowal of its own power. When they have the chance to vote for a king, they say, that's not right. You guys are supposed to sort this stuff out. Even though Shakespeare seems to be acutely aware that the crowd could enact a kind of power at any time. Whereas Du Bois shows how a democracy's interpretation can replace intention as the ultimate meaning of leaders' actions. Not only does this distinctive combination bolster Du Bois's ethos as a man of almost incomparable learning, and so he's drawing on his rhetoric training here, these iconic antecedents help him stage an argument that the U.S. must maintain Black voters' access to the ballot box and grant at least some Black students a liberal arts education in order to maintain the human half of a divinely forged communal bond. Otherwise, the nation may descend into the hell of autocracy, send its citizenry to the literal hell promulgated in the Christian conceptions of the afterlife, or both. And while I promise I have much, much more I could say, I'm going to stop subjecting you to my voice so that you all can take a break. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Stop my screen share. How do I do this? Oop. Did you just do that? All right.
Wasn't me.
Okay. I think I'm good. Can you guys, I apologize for the lighting, but probably better off not. Hey, Izzy. So, hey, Bo, how are you doing? There are some other students who were generous enough to support me during summer research projects, and they were also generously supported by the Palance Fund. So thank you guys so much for turning out. If anyone has questions, please, by all means, how can I help? Oh, no, not all at once.
We can happily answer questions in the chat if you've got any.
Oh, thanks, Bo. I've been working on that. I read a fair bit to my father. I'm reading like, so whenever we do newspaper quotes, I work on my transatlantic news radio.
That was pretty great.
Yeah,
Well, so
it's a little bit overwhelming, but there's, ask me questions about New England Calvinism. You can ask me questions about Hawthorne. You can ask me questions about Du Bois.
how about, oh, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Chris as well, Christenia, and I live in Maine about, I don't know, 35 miles from Nathaniel Hawthorne's birthplace and just
Yeah.
up the road from Bowdoin College where he went to college.
Yes.
So he's like the hometown boy here in Maine. And I go to a congregational church that was founded in 1784. So
Wow.
having all of that as a backdrop, it just seems like this is an interesting conversation because Congregationalists now don't look anything at all like what they did then.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it depends on the
we
conversation.
have this conversation quite often in our
Yeah.
church saying, what would those people from 1784 think of us as we put up our Black Lives Matter signs? Just comment.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to say. I'm not in the business of trying to reclaim anybody's reputation when it doesn't, like, those folks. I mean, I guess one thing to start with is those folks were kind of equal opportunity grouches. They didn't, the ideas that we have of race in the current moment may not apply equally well to that time. So if you're in anytime before 1676 or a little bit earlier than then, the word Negro probably would have referred to anybody with darker skin. And that could have been Southern Europeans as much as it could have been folks of Black African ancestry, and would have been for American Indians as well. Um, and so, to export contemporary notions of race um, would muddle the picture quite a bit. You would have a New England that managed to contrive a narrative of itself that it was largely free from the sins of slavery, in large measure because they didn't do it, when in fact, um,
They did.
Massachusetts Massachusetts was the first colony to formally enact legalized forms of slavery in the American colonies, but it wasn't race-based. It was the racialization of race
Right.
seems to have happened more in Virginia. But furthermore, the extent to which New England relied on slave labor, it more often dealt with enslaved American Indians and not enslaved Africans, for the reason that A, there was a much readier supply of people living by, and the means by which they were able to make slavery seem less odious to them was through debt peonage, right? So they would trap
Mm.
a good number of American Indians into debt, and then force them into sort of it wasn't um, it wasn't heritable in the way that Southern
Mhm.
laws made slavery heritable. So what do I think they would? I could only guess that they would shudder in absolute horror. But I mean, I can't imagine what of this life they could look at and even possibly understand.
Understand. One of the things that, if you look into Maine in particular, what you find is that the abolitionists were stronger inland than they were along the coastline, because along the coastline there was a large interaction with southern states
Yeah,
by sail. And so the port cities, the towns along the coastline, were far less likely to be abolitionists than those inland.
yeah,
So
yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and I think you would probably have seen the development of by you start to see the fracturing of the coast from inland as early as the Salem witch panic, where
mhm.
the more quote unquote provincial folks in Danvers, where
Mhm.
actual like hullabaloo really got kicked up, had very little in common economically with the folks on the coasts, and the folks on the coasts. I mean, even in Boston, even the Boston that Hawthorne writes about, 1640, you've got serious disputes among the ministers as to the high rates of taxation, and that's a lot of Hawthorne's story is set on the backdrop uh, of a merchant class that's deeply, deeply interested in trying to reduce the amount of taxes and boot Winthrop out of his office so that
Mm.
they can appoint someone else who's going to be more business friendly. So it's just like this tremendous irony that Reagan falls in love with the idea of John Winthrop, who's like the high tax, uh, no immigrants. It's really quite something. The ways in which these contemporary politicians managed to wrangle the history. I think that they wouldn't recognize anybody in this country. I don't think they would recognize the Christianities they see outside of, ironically, possibly forms of the Black Church, right? Which would have so many elements of Calvinist belief. That baptism probably shows more affinity with Congregationalism than Congregationalism now does, and or at least for a lot of congregations. So yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing that Emerson was the minister of the Second Church at Boston and was tossed from the pulpit because he didn't believe that they should practice the Lord's Supper at all. And so there are these controversies within the group of people, and so that whole thing about why I don't believe in Puritans, I just don't believe that there are any two people who believe the same thing. And as soon as you wrote something down or committed it to print, you'd get thrown out for being a heretic. So the only thing you could do is forge the idea or the illusion of consensus and orthodoxy through practice. But you couldn't really. That's the very nature of Protestantism, is that it tends to be against a thing, not for a thing. It's not proism. It's Protestantism, right? So it makes it kind of tricky, especially for those early folks who are fleeing repression in England and fleeing certain forms, but they're not really sure what form of Christianity they want for themselves. So I like to think that maybe Jonathan Edwards would look at that and say, yeah, I like that's about what I had in mind. I think if you read Edwards, you might see it, but it's not in those first generation folks. Um, then again, those the first generation folks were the folks who a large number of them had left Amsterdam because it was like Leiden and Holland, um, because you know the children weren't picking up their religious practices in the same way that they were. Um, so yeah, it's kind of tricky. You take a look and see, well, what is Congregationalism or what is Puritanism in 1630s and 1640s? It's like you can't find two people who would have said the same thing. Um, I'm glad to hear that things are going well in Maine. I love Maine. It's beautiful. Sarah, sure, I can tell more about research project. I've worked with I think 13 or 14 different either students or groups of students. Um, Bo got to go to Salem. Yeah. No, you didn't get. Well, I took you to Philadelphia, New York, right?
Yeah, we went to New York and Philadelphia.
Oh, right. Rose was in Salem. That's right. What did you? What did we work on together?
Me?
Yeah.
We were looking for like in the archives for indigenous papers of gosh, the Five Nations.
Oh,
We've got some cool little maps and stuff, but it was really cool going into those archives and going behind the scenes.
yeah. And I'm working on one version of Haudenosaunee creation. I'm trying to edit that right now, and I've worked with several folks on that over the course of time. Hopefully, within the next year, we'll come out with an edition of the longest known version of Iroquois creation. It's about 75,000 words in length. It's really vibrant. And then Izzy, what did we work on? I know it was an article. What did we work on, Izzy?
It was the Colson Whitehead article on infrastructure.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's the w- wow, I got to work on it with a couple different people on that one then. That's out in studies in the novel now. With other students, I've done a lot of work with students on the Haudenosaunee project, reading through a lot of obscure documents, in particular trying to make networks of who are the major um, non-human persons that are referenced. Sometimes they're deities, sometimes they're medicines, sometimes they're kind of cult heroes. But you know, a lot of times they're not translated into um, English, and so sometimes they're rendered phonetically in ways that look quite different. So creating databases of references to certain figures in Haudenosaunee culture that might be spelled differently across editions. Um, I worked with one group of students who did a lot of research into uh, women in colonial New England, and they actually produced a podcast. So you could look around for Olivia Banuelos and Nazaha Pennick produced a podcast about women in colonial New England. They taught me quite a bit about John Winthrop's sister Lucy, and her influence on his migrating out here or immigrating to the what is now the U.S. I'd have to go and take a look at the list of everyone I've worked with. I've had such a great range of folks on such a great range of topics, from sort of Faulkner and African American playwrights to infrastructure and Colson Whitehead to New England in 1636. I have lots of interests. It's one of the reasons I really love working at Whitman is, at most institutions where you have very large faculty, you have to be like a committed specialist. But I like to, um, I find myself all over the map. I really enjoy that. Oh, Bo works in the library now. Awesome.
Um, I don't know where the question is in this, but the part that really resonated with me from what you just shared was like the thought that everyone is essentially bad and evil and how destructive that is to communities. And it was just a good reminder, like how enduring that political stance is. Because sometimes it's like, where is all of this coming from? What does it hang on? And it's like, sometimes that thought.
I think we do have a cultural when I say we, I want to be pretty cautious about that. However, I do think that the predominant notion of Americanness was deliberately manufactured out of an idea of New England. And that idea of New England was superior to the idea of Southern slaveholders, right? So you don't want a bunch of folks who were lazy and pretty stupid, who, yeah, I mean, by and large, I should be careful with my language, but who did not venerate education in the same ways that we do today. And when you get folks trying to look at these 2 points, both of which are include a good many pretty flawed people. When you point to New England and you say, well, they had this form of town governance that was a lot like democracy. If and they get this idea of democracy from God. So if you come in here and you trample on everybody, and if the king comes in, tramples on everybody, and tries to impose kingly rule on top of this godly form of, like, that would be a heresy. That'd be wrong, right? So we have to stop the King George from stomping on us, and so, or we had to, right? We had to stop the king from stomping on us. How do you create a revolution, um, win the revolution, and then explain to other people that no other revolution makes sense, right? Like, if you're born out of revolution should be a legit option, but instead they're like, no, this isn't a revolution. We are preserving the natural order that's as designed by God. It wasn't a revolution. Point of fact, the king was revolutionary. He was just revolutionary in a bad sense. So America likes that story, but it winds up kind of adopting this civil religion. And when people turn to it, the forms of that civil religion manifest, or the forms that we adopt from that civil religion, they hang with us. Those instincts hang with us. It's one of the reasons why I think Hawthorne was so frustrated by this tendency to just look at somebody to immediately, absent other data, conclude a thing or something else. And I think that quick movement to judgment is something that I think a lot of us would benefit from less of that, if that's what you're getting at, though. I think a whole lot of us would benefit from getting to know other people and getting to know, um, maybe getting out, and no offense to the Zoom, but like getting out from behind the computers and getting to talk to other people and begin to formulate decisions on on who they are, rather than on bumper stickers they put on cars or clothes they wear. And maybe things would dial down just a little bit. Yeah, so you take the anonymity of the internet and the assumption that everybody's rotten, and you get like pretty bad outcomes, I guess. And Du Bois, I think, is really strategic in his appeal to saying, well, if you invite people in and you're going to make them part of your community, every single person in that community has a say in the outcome of this project. And uh, that might be something as ultimately insignificant as an economy or something, or might be as ultimately, and I want to frame this in Christian terms, in the end, as significant as the salvation of the whole of the nation. And calling people back into that mindfulness, that mindset was something that he was very eager to try and get New Englanders to do, and I think would be a pretty beneficial prescription for right now. As I kind of hurried to get this article together and this talk in certain respects, because the timing of it, I had wanted this to come out around the election, and thankfully it did. Although it didn't quite have the impact I was hoping it might. Just leave it at that. Yeah.
All right. Sounds like we're about done for the evening. Chris, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing these thoughts, answering questions. Loved having a few of your former students on and sharing their experiences with research in cooperation with you. We appreciate it very much.